Thank you very much for inviting me today, and thank you very much for being able to talk on this particular topic. So obviously, I will focus primarily on the refugee crisis and the implications of the refugee crisis that we're going to have. Just to start off with a little figure that American intelligence before the war started estimated that we're going to have roughly about 5 million refugees from Ukraine during the war. But I can safely say that this is not going to be sufficient, that we are very likely to see something along the lines of 10 million refugees until August. So we're going to see the most significant refugee crisis that we've seen since the Second World War. Just in the first week of the war, we had a refugee flow of 1.5 million, which was larger than the refugee crisis that Europe had in 2015, 2016 from largely the southern Mediterranean. So we have a crisis that is much, much more important than in terms of numbers and in terms of possible implications than what we've had in 2015, 2016. And I may add that I told people, decision makers, I told them since probably last September, last October, that this is likely to happen in the near future. And it was foreseeable from all the facts that we had on the ground that this is likely to happen. But let me just put this first in a broader framework, because it is important to point out that while we have a battle fight between Russia and the Ukraine, there's a larger geopolitical fight that is going on inside Russia, and that is the two versions of Russia. The one version of Russia that is the modernist version of Russia, the nationalist version of Russia that wants to be part of the Western world, perhaps embodied by President Gorbachev, by President Yeltsin later, that is very clearly losing the battle, and the possibly more imperialist and perhaps also more isolationist version of Russia that is obviously being portrayed by former Soviet President Stalin, and that is also being pushed at this particular moment. Now, why do I say that? I say that because it is important in understanding why this refugee crisis and why this immigration crisis is so important. It is important because it harks back at why Russia needs to fight the Nazis. It goes back to this idea, why is Russia announcing a justification for this particular war, which is denazifying Ukraine? Now, as a scholar of terrorism and of counterterrorism, I'm very aware that this is a Soviet argument that has been made since the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. All of the Western countries were constantly accused of being the Nazis, being a successor of the Nazis, being a fascist state. This went on throughout the Cold War period as an argument of Soviet propaganda, of course. And that was also something of why certain terrorist groups were supported in Western Europe in the 1970s. For instance, Baader-Meinhof in Germany was very much in that ideological spirit. And also, if we look at the Red Brigades in Italy, if we look at all of these kind of terrorist groups that were supported in the 1970s, that was very much in that particular mindset. The West, the Nazis, and therefore any kind of political violence is legitimate against fighting against the Nazis. It goes back to the most glorious moment of Soviet history, which is, of course, the defeat of the Nazis in the Great Patriotic War in the Second World War. And as a result of that, there's a desire to relive those battles in order to, of course, make Russia great again. So in that sense, it is very important to put that into context, because, of course, it also goes back to which groups are being supported today in Europe and the European Union by Russia. And we see on the whole, there's a lot of support but for a lot of different far-right groupings. So we see, for instance, the financing of the presidential campaign of Marine Le Pen in France. We see the financing of the Lega Nord, Salvini. We see the financing of the Alternative für Deutschland in Germany. We see the financing of the Brexit campaign in the United Kingdom. We see the financing of a lot of far-right activity because, of course, in order to be able to fight the West needs to embody the Nazis. So that is something very, very important, and that is also why the current war is being justified as a denazification campaign of Ukraine that is now perceived to be part of the West, that is now perceived to be an enemy of Russia. And because it is perceived to be an enemy of Russia, it is being called a Nazi, just like Western Europe, just like in general was being called in the 1970s, in the 1950s. This is a usual rhetorical tool. Now, how does it bring us back to the migration crisis? This brings us back to the migration crisis because, of course, there were elements of that already in terms of Russian support for the refugee flows in 2015, 2016, went then through Turkey and then went through the European Union, and at the time caused something very significant. And of course, one of the big indicators of Russian support of the Belarusian crisis that we had last autumn, when President Lukashenko brought thousands of refugees from the Middle East, from Iraq, from Turkey, from a number of different countries, that were then planted at the border of Poland and were then pushed across the border into the European Union, also to cope with those flows of refugees, which were at the time not particularly numerous in terms of actual numbers, but of course was still significant because it was a clear test case for the Kremlin to see how would Europe react to those numbers. And what we're seeing now is that we're dealing with a hugely different number game. We're dealing with very significant numbers, the most significant numbers that we've seen. And I remember asking people in Brussels, I remember asking them before the war whether they were prepared for war. And at the time, it was something of a heresy. You couldn't plan for the war. You couldn't plan for any kind of refugee crisis that would come from the war, because that would mean that you make the war happen almost by talking about it, even though the signs were very clear that the war was coming. It was very clearly, in terms of empirical science, that this was going to happen. You couldn't plan for this. Now, what is currently happening is that the European Union has taken a decision that we never thought would happen. In a sense, 30 years ago, roughly 30 years ago, the European Union adopted a regulation on mass migration. It was adopted just after the wars in Yugoslavia, the successor wars in Yugoslavia, where it was seen that, you know, in cases of mass exodus of people, the European Union would have to react somehow to accommodate those streams. Certainly, you could prevent people from the former Yugoslavia at the time to arrive in the European Union. So they needed to develop a legal instrument to deal with those kind of streams. This legal instrument was never really used. It wasn't used at any point. And in fact, last year, the European Union discussed abolishing that instrument entirely. There was some efforts within some EU institutions to keep it alive, but realistically, they were discussing abolishing this instrument because for 30 years it was not used. For the first time ever, this has been used now. Just with the war in Ukraine, it has been used. It has been breathed a new breath of life, if you will. And it is now possible for Ukrainian refugees to arrive in the European Union. There is no restriction on numbers. There is no restriction on anything. But the problem is that while there's no restriction in terms of numbers, there's also no planning that went with this. So what we're going to have is a situation where we will have very significant amount of refugees coming to the European Union, probably distributed across the European Union, but we will have a very significant amount in the major countries like Germany, France, and others. Perhaps not so much in Britain, because Britain decided not to make it easy for Ukrainian refugees to come into Britain. But there will be a very, very significant amount of numbers, and there is very, very little planning for it. So we will see probably in 2 to 3 months, we will see severe problems that are going to arise from those numbers because of the lack of planning, because of the lack of investment, because of the lack of foresight. And these are going to feed into the same political movements that we've had after 2015, 2016, when we will see that, of course, the far right will capitalize from those streams of people that are invariably going to find problems. Russian propaganda will obviously portray the West as Nazi, and this is something that is new. This is invariably going to happen. I'm certain that Russian propaganda is going to portray German rearmament in the same light. This is also something, and Western rearmament in general will be portrayed in that particular way as well, which will then also feed into the narrative of a strengthening of the far right. But it will also strengthen the far right in terms of substance, because in terms of substance, we will see increasing levels of political support. We will see continuing financing of far right activities by the Russian state, as there has been for the last 10 years, 15 years. We will see financing of Russian state of far-right terrorist groups, which they also have been doing for the last 10 years. It's also not something new. It's something that has been done for a number of years. So we will see a lot more of that, probably also part of a revenge. You know, you were putting sanctions on us, so we're going to sponsor far-right terrorists instead. So we're going to see a very, very frictional relationship between Europe and Russia for the next years to come. I'm not sure that Cold War is necessarily the best term, because the Cold War, in fact, was cold, whereas what we're seeing at the moment is a little bit more heated than the Cold War. But we're going to see, inside Russia, we're going to see the takeover of the isolationists. We're going to see Russia trying to decouple itself from the Western world. And that is going to feed into the frictional development between the West and Russia. Also, the kind of more Western-minded Russians are going to be obviously silenced over the last, I mean, they were already silenced over the last couple of years. That is going to be a trend that is going to continue over the next couple of years. And that will lead to a more frictional relationship, and will continue to increase problems inside Russia and inside the European Union and inside the West more generally. So I don't have much of a word of optimism right now, because it's very difficult to be optimistic how to spiral this escalation backwards so that we can go to a more peaceful time period, that we, in a sense, some of the most peaceful time period between Russia and the West has been the 1990s and the 2000s, in fact. But it's very difficult to imagine how we can go back to that time period. I think we've seen a very structural change, and yeah, so I'll end on this relatively pessimistic note, and I'm sorry and I apologize for that. Thank you.